This panel, we've called it informally the Oceans Panel, but it has a much more exciting name, and I'll give it to you, which is The Future of Seascapes, Navigating Security Challenges. And we talk about it being the future of seascapes, but I'm actually going to start off by taking you back sort of 600, 700 years. We're in Stockholm, one of the Hanseatic cities. This region has always been a venue for ocean-based prosperity, economic, cultural prosperity. And it's quite clear that seascapes, therefore, have always been critical in this region, in the Baltic. And they continue to be that. Marine infrastructure is critical now already to meeting the EU's green transition goals and energy security goals. But there are plenty of competing currents in these seascapes. We have geopolitical rivalries, environmental obligations, and the rapid digital transformation of maritime operations. So this panel is an opportunity for us to dive into a whole range of issues: national security, offshore wind, data governance, and environmental opportunities to help us secure a sustainable maritime infrastructure. And to kick us off, I'm very happy that we have a fantastic panel and speaker, and I shall introduce them to you right now. They are Lina Kinning, who is from the Offshore Wind Association. Please come up and join us on the stage, Lina. Hans Levong, who is Professor of System Science for Defence and Security at the Swedish Defence University. Carina Barkett, Senior Research Fellow from SEI. Matthias Rust, Deputy Director at the Ministry of Rural Affairs and Infrastructure. And Magnus Wallhagen, who has the most amazing title of anybody in the room, because he is Sweden's national hydrographer. Who wouldn't want that? Fantastic. Matthias, very warm welcome. But I don't only have 5 fantastic panelists, I also have an opening speaker for you, Torsten Linders. Torsten, very warm welcome. You're also program director of another MISTRA program, trying to connect all the dots here. MISTRA, Co-Creating Better Blue. Over to you for a quick introduction.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a question to the audience. Are there any U2 fans here today? I see a few hands. I'm very happy about that. Then you may recognize this statement. These are difficult times we're all living in, and you need a rock and roll band that tells you that. That was Bono, the singer in U2. Bono may or may not have been referring to the geopolitical situation around the Baltic Sea and the global ocean in general. But I think the panel and perhaps a lot more people here in the room agree that there are difficulties there, or challenges, maybe we should call them. Especially challenging are new situations, new things, when the old ways, the old assumptions are challenged, sometimes overthrown for the times they are changing. That was Bob Dylan, of course. And I think that we are living in a period of ocean change, of sea change. We are, to pick a big word here, we are living through the dawn of a new era. What I'm referring to is how we as humans, as societies, relate to the ocean. We have always related to the ocean. We have always depended on the ocean. We were taken 600 years back just a moment ago, and even before that, of course. We are, in a way, marine mammals. However, we have been out there by means of boats, ships, vessels. And now we are pouring concrete and steel into the ocean. It's a built-up seascape growing out there. We are used to talk about the built-up landscape. We will have to start talking about the built-up seascape. And that, I believe, will change a lot of things. We don't know exactly where this is going, and we don't know how fast the implications will be, how fast the implications will come. My feeling is that we tend to underestimate how far-reaching the implications will be. It will not only be about renewable energy and some clever multi-use together with aquaculture. It will change our perception of ocean freedom. It will change our ideas about ownership at sea, about responsibilities, about conflict, about collaboration, of warfare. Okay, maybe I'll repeat responsibilities again to end in a sort of a positive way. And I'm super glad that we have a rock and roll panel who will guide us and say some clever things about that. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks, Thorstein. I'm desperately trying to think of some more song titles. I don't know whether we're all living in a yellow submarine. But, let me start off. I mentioned the Hanseatic League to start off with, and funnily enough, the Hanseatic League never had a sort of centralised sort of structure for between countries to try and discuss, problems and issues. That's not the case now. We have the Baltic Sea, and we have the Baltic Sea in the EU. And so I'd like to turn to Matthias and just tap into your knowledge and experience. And perhaps you can give us something sort of an update, an overview of the interaction between EU governance and the Baltic Sea. Where do we lie, and what are the key priorities for alignment between EU goals, EU frameworks, and the Baltic, where we are now?
All right. That's quite a lot, but I'll make a go at it. And I think this is a good way to tap into what we talked previously about AI. AI is something new, something that we are still grappling with. The ocean has obviously been there for a long time, but if you compare ocean governance with land governance, it's still something that is not as mature as land governance. If you look at the structure of ministries and authorities, you see that it's lots of silos going out into the ocean, and they're governing a small portion of the ocean. And the problem has of course, been the description we just had about how everything is growing and changing. And if you have a governance system that looks at small pieces at a time, you cannot cope with these changes. So during the last decades, we have been working with trying to look at the ocean as a whole and have a governance structure that can look at it as a whole. But when we are saying that, I mean, as a whole, the question is still, what do we want to do with it? What are we doing with it, and what do we want to do with it? And we have already realized that if we look at it from a holistic and integrated way, we can make the decisions we need to maximize the use, but also sustainability. And we have, in the EU context and globally, sort of coined the expression sustainable blue economy, which is a way to build in a goal or a concept of where we want to go. But if you look at how people perceive that concept, the concept is changing all the time. And that is something that we have been discussed during the morning, how concepts change over time. So if we have this umbrella of sustainable blue economy, underneath that umbrella, we have lots of activities that shift over time in a political focus. And I'll get back to the focus and how that shift for these different industries. But the fact that they shift over time means that we cannot have a plan and think that that plan will be sufficient to meet the problems that we have. Because the plan, the goal, the challenges we have is changing all the time. So we need rather, the planning is much more important than the plan. Because if we do have the planning structure, it's much more easier to cope with the changes in priorities that is happening all the time. But to do planning, we need data. So we get back to this kind of data. And the question then, if you talk about the ocean, which is sometimes much more difficult than on land, because everything is moving and mixing. Do we measure what matters? And is it something that matters that we actually don't measure? This is the kind of question that we are still grappling with. So to go back a little bit to the concept of sustainable blue economy and how it changed over the years, and this sort of umbrella of sustainable blue economy and all the small actors, or not so small, I mean, we're talking huge actors, but I mean the different kind of actors in between. In the EU context, we start to work with this in the beginning of this century. There was a blue book on integrated maritime policy, and then it developed into strategies. And the first strategy was in 2012, the Limassol Declaration. And 2012, it was a couple of years after the huge economic crisis in 2007 and 2008. And that sort of, that colored how that strategy was shaped. And it was focused on jobs and money. But then the good years came, and the discussion came much more about the sustainability. So in the strategies that came like 2022, everything was about sustainability, because that's what we had focused on during sort of the good years, with less war and crisis and a quite strong economy. Now, when Ursula von der Leyen declared that we're supposed to have a European Oceans Pact, if you read the basic phrases of what they see in front of themselves with this Ocean Pact, it's less emphasis on sustainability. It's not that it disappeared, but now it's not only about sustainability, but you see all these other words coming into how they describe the problem and the solutions. And you see that it's much more about talking about Europe as a unit. You know, the holistic EU approach. They're talking about security issues. Things like energy is, of course, very important nowadays. So, although we have a goal of sustainable blue economy, the concept is shifting all the time. And we need to be able to plan, to have a continuous planning process to be able to reach this changing goal all the time. And if you want to interact with this Oceans Pact, there is actually a call for evidence going on right now until the 15th of February. So if you are into the ocean and you have some good ideas how we can manage that better, it's up to you to send in your thoughts to the Commission. And on European Maritime Day in Cork, they will deliver a communication on this topic. Very interesting. So I'll stop there.
Matthias, thank you very much. What an overview you've given us, I think. Absolutely fun, really great. So don't forget that date, get it in your diaries. You mentioned the importance of energy and how that's really sailed up the political agenda, and it's been something that is really critical within this umbrella of the sustainable blue economy. I want to turn to you, Lena, and actually seize upon the energy, but possibly also the tensions between different silos. Energy on the one side and national security policy on the other. We recently had some decisions in Sweden. Could you just give us a little bit of a background about this tension on offshore wind permits
Yeah.
and where that's at now and why we're at the place we are in the Swedish context?
Right. Well, I can start with we have a wind of change within the offshore sector at the moment in Sweden. And normally we used to say, like, in Sweden, we have a system for something, right? You're familiar with that. We have a system of this and that, and we're quite proud of it quite often. When it comes to offshore wind in Sweden, we really don't have a system or haven't had a system that is functioning to deliver offshore wind. Maybe in the pace that we want, but what do we want? What is the ambition for the offshore wind sector in Sweden? Mattias mentioned a lot of declarations and policies and targets in the EU, and on the energy side, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it has been rushed with these policies. We have had emergency regulations on energy security to try to detach from Russia's gas and fossil oil into Europe. And wind power, both onshore and offshore, has been seen as one of the enablers to make that happen. So we have the Renewable Energy Directive, and we have those kind of directives in EU, but we also have declarations such as Marienborg declarations and the Baltic Energy Security Declaration that Sweden has signed with targets in them. And for these declarations, for example, we have a 20 gigawatt build out of offshore wind in the Baltic Sea until 2030. Which is quite a lot.
How many wind turbines is there?
I don't really know how many. It depends on how high they are. But you can count that one large wind farm is about 1 to 2 gigawatts. Okay. So quite many in the Baltic Sea up until 2030. So it's quite a lot. And the 4th of November, it's our Guy Hawkins Day, we had this decision from the government of 13 projects in Sweden being totally declined. And they were in the permit phase, but quite different how long they had been on the government's table. Some of them had been there just a few weeks, so it's quite difficult to say how much they had been looked into in depth. So 13 projects being declined that could have given up to 30 gigawatts of energy, or installed electricity. So it's a lot, and it was quite a surprise to us, and especially because we have those targets and we have the build-out goals in the Baltic Sea. But I think we need to separate a little bit on the possibilities to coexist with offshore wind and defense between what's possible within the processes and what's possible, like, technologically speaking. Because we know that there are possible ways of coexisting with the defense forces as well as with the other interests in the oceans and the seas. But the processes in Sweden isn't that far ahead. So there weren't really a way for these companies who applied for permits to discuss with the defense forces. And they weren't. So we really didn't have that process in Sweden. So the defense forces come in quite late in the process when it comes to a definite no. And that is about to change a bit in the future. There's been investigations and inquiries, and we're quite good at that in Sweden, our systems, to have inquiries. But what has been said is that it's not possible to coexist in the Baltic Sea, and we know that other countries around the Baltic Sea thinks it differently. For example, right at the border to the Polish waters, we have quite many parks being developed in order to illustrate the difference between how we see the possibilities and not. So that raises a lot of questions, of course. How much did the countries talk to each other beforehand? We don't know. I hope they do. I hope they really talk to each other around the Baltic Sea. But that makes it even more difficult to think that we absolutely can't do this in Sweden, but they can do it elsewhere, in other parts of the Baltic Sea. which is possible, of course, but it's a lot of questions around those decisions, and I think it raises an awareness of we need to talk much more about the processes of how to make this happen, how we can be transparent between different countries also, and also how we can transfer those targets and goals and policies from the declarations into actual action and into decisions. Because this is one thing to have targets and goals, and it's another thing to actually make it happen.
Thank you very much, Lina. Hans, I wanted to turn to you. I know that you probably have a story about these permits and the offshore wind, and if you'd like to say something about that, that'd be great. But I also want you to reflect on how we can make sure that these offshore wind energy farms and other energy systems can be resilient in this contested seascapes that we see.
Well, first I must say that also I work with defense and the Baltic Sea. I also was surprised by the decision by the Swedish government. So it's not just the ones that want to build wind farms that are surprised. I was as well. And I also have gotten questions from for instance, Estonia after that also plans in the Baltic Sea, in these areas where Sweden say, no, it's not suitable. Then journalists from Estonia say, are we wrong in Estonia when continuing with this planning? And of course, I don't really know what to answer them, because I don't really know what the decision was based on from a defense perspective. And you say that we want to have the wind farms resilient. I would say that we want to have a resilient society. And of course, we've talked about diversity this morning many times, and this is the case here as well. At the moment, we don't have any power production or substantial power production in the Baltic Sea going into Sweden. So that would increase the diversity of the power production for Sweden doing it. That will then mean that our society will be more resilient. And so it's not only about making sure that the wind farms themselves are resilient, it's actually contribution to the Swedish society. And then there are many things that we can do with wind farms to increase the control over these areas. We talked about data at sea, so we are still exploring the sea. And of course, wind farms could help us explore the Baltic Sea a bit better, not only for defense purposes, but for many different purposes. So there are many things we can do to solve this, but we needed to do it together. The defense cannot do it. The civilian contractors cannot do it themselves. We need to find collaborations within Sweden, but also with our neighbors. And then we can solve this. No problem. And with that, we will get more information about the Baltic Sea as well, that we can use for other purposes as well. Both to identify anchor draggings, but also to identify fish, birds, bird life, and so on, that we can use as well. So there are many things that we can do, but at the moment, that planning is not going on.
And we're not going to create some new vulnerabilities by adding lots more infrastructure in the ocean, like the sort of cables that we've seen that have been cut or mysteriously severed.
But for me, those are not... I would like to have the vulnerabilities out to sea instead of on land in Sweden. That is much... If things really would get worse, and these vulnerabilities would be affected by cyber attacks or actual attacks, then I'd much rather have them all out in the Baltic Sea than on land. So it depends, but we will have a more diverse society that will withstand it.
Do you share this Lina, from the perspective of an association that's representing developers, operators of offshore wind? Do you share this sort of optimistic view of the possibility?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think Hans' perspective on collaboration is very important. Of course, that can be difficult in terms of defense, to have that openness and transparency that might be needed. But I think we need to find the right processes to be able to talk to each other on how to do this. But I also think it's very important to stress what are the ambitions? If we're going to do this, if we're going to build out anything anywhere, we need to know why we're doing it. So the motives for it, we need to have some direction and ambition clear, so that we know why we're doing it as well. And I think so. The society needs to kind of be aligned in the goals and be aligned with the processes. If we set targets for build out renewable energy in Europe, then we need to be prepared to actually do it as well. So I think...
Yeah. And for me, from the defense perspective, it is if or when defense is so important as it is now, then defense cannot do that themselves. They need to include more people as a part of the defense or societal development. And of course, then we need all the different businesses that we have in Sweden. And this is one that we then need to work together with instead of closing or locking out of the discussion. So if we really want to join forces and make change.
Matthias.
Yeah, I just wanted to, since I'm working so closely with the politicians, I mean, we need to have what I was talking about, a planning process that is robust and flexible. And for that, we need data. But we can never take the politics out of it. I mean, it's not only scientists and civil servants, because if it was only scientists and civil servants, we would probably always think long-term, 20, 30 years, and be sometimes good, but perhaps sometimes also less flexible. Politics, and especially in a democracy, it can go quite quickly, and we can never plan for what the next government will be doing. It's always a little bit, something may always happen, and we cannot plan away that. We don't want to plan that away either.
I want to bring Karina in here if I can. Karina, you're researching a lot around oceans and security. We've heard many winds of change that have blown across European policy making and national priorities. What's your take on how to sort of stay the course, navigate a sort of towards a sustainable future?
Wow, what a question. I don't think I have the answer. I'm actually also, I should say, the least equipped to speak about these things because we have eminences here on the stage compared to me. But we have been anyways looking at what these dynamics mean and how to interpret them. Just, for example, 2 years ago, when we started the Ministry of Geopolitics research project on the blue economy, we initiated the project with the idea that, well, energy is securitized, and with it, the ocean is also becoming increasingly securitized. Now, securitized is something that goes from being an everyday issue to becoming a security priority. And this was very much based on all the EU directives, the renewable directives. There was some sort of very quick directive, it's not the right word, but something...
Emergency regulations.
Emergency regulations that where countries would need to prioritize the generation of electricity above all other things. So at the time, our concern was what's going to happen with the environment. As Torsten pointed out, we're building and we're planning to build even more in seas that might seem empty to the naked eye, but if you look at maps and navigation lines, they're actually not that empty, and they very often overlap with migratory fish patterns as well. So our concern was then, how electricity and energy generation became security and how everything else becomes sort of less important compared to that. And while we were writing our paper, which I hope it doesn't get rejected because of the Swedish government decision, while we were writing the paper on it, then things just changed really quickly. And our energy in Sweden was no longer securitized compared to the real security problems or the real security problems. And so I think this dynamism on how things turn into a priority or not is quite interesting. And it's, I would say, shockingly fast in a way that maybe the literature hadn't looked at it before. Back then, we have a few IR colleagues in the crowd. Back then, when Busan and the Copenhagen School came up with this theory, things were happening a little bit more slowly over decades. Things are now changing from week to week. So it's difficult to keep up and understand what this means. But something where we've thought that there could be like a way out of this lockdown situation is data, and how data could be, data is generated every day on different types of aspects, and even though in the marine space data gathering and data sets are not as developed and is as in the urban landscapes or the land-based landscapes, there is still data being generated. So what can we find a way around it? Can we collaborate around data, which is seemingly less of a polemic or contentious issue, we thought. But maybe I actually leave that to Magnus.
It'd be great to hear from you, Magnus. And you mentioned, Karina, that oceans look sort of just big and blue on maps, and then we decide to change them to the Gulf of America instead of the Gulf of Mexico. So there's plenty of contention even on these blank spaces. So it's time to hear from the national hydrographer about data and what is actually there in the sea.
Yeah, I mean, it's. Thank you for the bridge here. And data, it's complex because if we see on a global basis, we only have when we talk about topography of the seabed, which we call bathymetry, we have only 20% knowledge, and then I mean a square of 1,000 by 1,000 meter, one depth. In one grid cell, we have 20% of the grids we have one depth. So 80% of the seabed, we don't really know how it looks like. If we look here in the Stockholm archipelago, we know more about the surface of March than we know about the seabed of Stockholm archipelago. That's so how we need the knowledge to take decisions. And so this is a bit of a challenge. But if I go to, I come from, I'm very much involved in the maritime sector, and of course we do have much more high quality data for the maritime industry, fairways and so on. And we have talked a lot about how can we trust the data. And when you talk about AI, you need to know if the models, you can trust the models, the data that has been used in the models. So the maritime industry, and when we talk about navigation, of course, they must trust the data. They must know that it is more or less 100% sure. So when we are going from only 20 years ago, the navigation was trusted paper charts. Now we have electronic charts, and we are changing now for having electronic charts to also include all the other navigation data that you need, like wind current, water level, surface currents, anything that you need for navigation into one system that you have on board. So when you do that, you need to trust the data, and then you need to have cybersecurity measurements, you need to have digital signatures, so you know that the data that has been delivered from one authority is the data that you have in your navigation system. And as part of that, also the maritime industry is prepared to pay for this. So this is good because it gives kind of monetary possibilities for us as a hydrographic office in Sweden to actually develop this data. But it sometimes creates a bit of tension for the academia who is used to want open data. You don't prepare to pay for the data, so that's a bit of a challenge there.
Do you have access to the best data, or does that data lie somewhere else? Is it with the people who are building stuff in the ocean?
I would say from the commercial side and from our side, we have quite a good cooperation. So because there is also will from the commercial side to pay for the data. So I think the tension is more from the academic side. But if we have, who knows who has the best data? I would claim that we have the best data available, but it's probably an open question.
Matthias?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in from what we talked about before lunch about the AI, and we talked about China, the US, and the EU. And there is, of course, a difference because the EU has something that China and the US don't have, and it's a lot of countries. And that means that when we are going to work as a team, to get the data from the member state is not that easy. We don't have a specific coordinated system for all kinds of ocean data. It is within certain directives, but not for all kind of data. And the Commission have prepared a paper or a regulation on ocean observation, and it was planned to be presented during the Swedish presidency, and I actually thought that I was the one going to negotiate it. But it was pulled back, so it was not presented, and although the Commission didn't actually say straight out why, it was quite clear that it had some connection with some kind of a pipeline rupture. You know, suddenly information about the ocean wasn't as innocent no more. And I think that regulation was written, you know, before the whole war started. And suddenly it was simply probably not designed correctly. So I think that in this, we will see a new version of it in this European Oceans Pact. But it will be a changed version where security matters will color it much more than in the original one.
I have a question. I'm not the ones who's supposed to maybe ask, but I have it. So, I mean, we see that collaboration between security interests and private interests and even sometimes civil interest has worked out in other sectors and in other countries. And sometimes the US is brought forward as an example where there has been good collaboration, either the private sector developing or sharing their data or vice versa. What's so special about the US, or why can't we get it to work in Sweden and in the EU? What's the problem?
I think, and Lena, you mentioned about the process, and we need to talk to each other. And I actually have a really good experience having discussion with our Navy in Sweden. When we transform to these new standards that are being developed and the navigational landscape being changed, we need to also include high density bathymetry data in our systems, which is of course very sensitive for the Navy because they are, you know, we have been hunting submarines in Sweden for several years, so they want to protect the bathymetry data. And we have had, the last years, we had a very productive discussion with the Navy and try to explain what we want to develop for the maritime sector. And I found them very understanding, and then we could maybe find ways to limit this new product, but also to implement them. So I think there is possibilities if we just get to start the discussions together.
Lena?
Yeah, definitely a lot of improvements can be made, but I'm just, I think we need to discuss the difference between different data as well, because the seabed data, you need to have a permission to be able to spread it around. I don't know how to say it, like so that it doesn't come in the wrong hands, of course. But other kind of data, like environmental inventories and such, we could really benefit from sharing more. So we just need to create a system that is possible in terms of what both quality and security and other stuff.
and when an offshore developer is preparing an application, they're gathering this sort of data around sort of the environmental aspects, fish stocks, etc., etc.
Yeah, they need to do that in order to put together an impact assessment for the permit application. But they're also investigating the seabed, of course, to be able to know how they're going to install and what kind of construction they're going to install there. So a lot of different types of data. So I think it's also important to distinguish between these different data and maybe prioritize what data is most important to share and if it's possible to do it in a good way.
There is actually a good story from the end of the Cold War on this kind of data, because the seabed doesn't really move around that much. But if you talk about wave height and wind speed and pressure, that changes all the time. So in the middle of the North Atlantic, no one really measures the wave height and if there is not a ship out there. And of our environmental models and weather models are really requiring data from the North Atlantic, because the weather in Europe is like dominated by North Atlantic. So when the Cold War ended, the UK Navy didn't really see a point in going out on the North Atlantic during storms. There were no one out there, so they could stay at home during the storms. That meant that no one measured these parameters in the North Atlantic. So actually our weather models got less precise as a result of the end of the Cold War, because no one was out there measuring all the things that we needed to get good weather forecasts in Europe. And that is a measurable change in that. And of course, if we would have had a wind turbine out there, they could have provided that. And of course, if we have one in the middle of the Baltic Sea, they could provide with that. So these kind of data is even more scarce than the seabed data that we talk about.
Staying on the data point, Magnus, bring you back in again. I think I mentioned in the opening the rapid change and digitization of maritime and transport, maritime infrastructure and transport. Can you tell us a little bit about what those trends are? Because they're happening quickly and probably almost invisibly for most of us.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that we just 20 years ago had paper charts, and now we have what we have now in the shipping industry is more or less a digital version of the old paper chart. Now we're changing that into all the data that you mentioned about being included in one system. We had a decision made at the UN Body for Shipping, International Maritime Organization, a few years ago. So from the 1st of January 2026, these new systems can be installed voluntary, but from 1st of January 2029, these new systems must be installed if there is new systems. So this is what's happening now, and this is of course a lot of challenges for member states to implement as well. And we were talking about regulation previously, and we had this decision in the International Maritime Organization, which is a platform, but we need to make use of all like cooperation, regional cooperation, and you mentioned the Hanseatic tradition. Maybe I think that we have a very unique situation in the Baltic, that we have a lot of good cooperation between the Baltic, the countries around the Baltic Sea, except of one, as you understand. And that's where we cooperate to implement these new standards, these new products into this new navigational system. So we're quite lucky to have neighbors around us that want to cooperate, I would say.
It's great that you answered on cooperation. We're going to pull this panel together with one final question that you can all take the opportunity to answer, which is, and quickly and briefly, have you got any examples of really good cooperation that manages to sort of, if you like, square the circle between all these competing interests, these policy silos? Any good examples, Lena?
What comes into mind is the maritime spatial planning process, and that's not a very good example. I'm sorry. So that could be a very good example of how different interests could come together and be discussed, because all the relevant authorities and agencies are supposed to work on this. There's room for improvement there, because now, like the defense agency was part of this, but couldn't really share data. So that interest isn't really in the last proposal. So I think those kind of planning instruments are, I think, even if they're not a binding, they're voluntary or just guiding documents. They're really the foundation for where we can start to talk.
So some potential there in
marine
spatial planning, just if we could get the right people in the room with the willingness and ability to be actually to say things and share things.
And share things, I think.
Hans?
Well, I think the Swedish-Finnish cooperation that's going on for more than for many hundred years, but in this case for the Baltic Sea over the last 30 years. And to my feeling, it really started from the lower levels within the military, but also in other areas, and built up. And that means that today Sweden and Finland share a lot of data that not only affects the defense forces and how they can cooperate and collaborate, but also how we can work with maritime safety and shipping safety in the Baltic. And that has then spread to the political level and so on. So I think that kind of collaboration that has gone on for a very long time has proven to be very important over the last 2 years when we're talking about the Baltic Sea and the defense, but also safety. And we wouldn't have been here if we hadn't that close cooperation for many years with Finland.
I want to mention 2 short ones. One is HELCOM, that a lot of you know. It's often highlighted as a good collaboration, as an example of good collaboration internationally, also as a reference point to other similar types of collaboration over sea basins. Russia is involved in HELCOM, and although at the moment it's paused, this has sort of withstand and gone on for many, many years, and I somehow feel like it will continue at some point. And the second one, which might be less known, is the collaboration between the energy sector and fisheries in Norway around spatial planning. You can see a lot of things, and maybe their spatial plans are not entirely developed yet, but the dialogue that they have is actually quite amazing. And I'd say what I take from their example is that Norway has decided on a vision of what the ocean, what their seas should look like, what they should deliver on. And that's something Sweden has not decided.
Matthias?
Yeah, I sort of felt like all my words were stolen here by the previous spoken, because I was going to speak about the icebreakers, how we cooperate with Finland. We share everything with the Finns, and we cooperate with the icebreakers. But Finland is a little bit of a special example. I was going to talk about HELCOM. Lena, that's your old portfolio. The good thing with HELCOM, just to tie with what I said before, that planning is more important than a plan. HELCOM is exactly that. We have a structure, so when things happen that we need to react to, we have that kind of a structure, the kind of a interface where we can easily start to talk about new things that we think are important. And for instance, the government just published the new regulation on scrubber discharges, and that is coordinated together with the Danes and the Finns, and that hadn't happened if we don't have this constant cooperation about various things. So it makes us flexible to cooperate. And then I would like to a little bit go against you there about the marine spatial planning. As I said in my talk previously, that ocean policy is much more immature than land policy because we are land animals. So when we create a spatial plan for the ocean, it is our first. Of course, it is not without errors and things that need improving. But you know, in order to get to the top of the stairs, you need to step on the first stairs and not yell at them because they don't take you to the top straight away. You have to work your way up. And this was the first trial, and it was actually quite beautiful work by Jakob and your team at Havs- and Vattenmyndigheten to see who's actually out there. I mean, we didn't really know who's out in the ocean. What are they doing? And we're not done, you know. We don't know that exactly. It's still a problem with, I'm being too lengthy, but it's still a problem with statistics. We don't know exactly what kind of industries and how much money they generate because they get mixed up with land-based industries. So we still have a huge way to go to know what's out there, what's the value for the society. And before we can balance all that out, we need to know all this. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. The last word, 30 seconds to you, Magnus.
With the experience of the standardization that I was talking about, I would say that the coalition of the willingness, you can come quite far. And that goes back to the opening speech from Lena, that with us being grown up in the golden era, something for you, younger, to take with you, the coalition of the willingness, you can come far.
Thank you, Magnus. Thanks to this panel. It's time for coffee again.